Today, I have the pleasure to speak with Tancredi Gusman, who will be joining us from Milan to answer our two questions. Tancredi Gusman is art and theater theorist and historian. He serves as assistant professor in theater and performance studies in the Department of History, Humanities and Society, University of Rome Tor Vergata. Prior to his appointment, Tancredi was research associate at the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts and member of the project Collecting the Ephemeral, founded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. He led the EU Horizon 2020 project Between Evidence and Representation, History of Performance Art Documentation from 1970s to 1977. At the Freie Universität Berlin. And he was also Marie Curie Research Fellow at the International Research Center Interweaving Performance Cultures. In 2016, he completed a postdoctorate at the University of Milan for the EU project Sensus, the Sensory Theater. In 2012, he graduated with a PhD at the University of Napoli, L'Orientale. In addition, he served as an assistant director and director, dramaturg, and curator for theaters and productions in Switzerland, Germany, and France. Tancredi published really widely on the politics of representation and spectatorship, and on the history of performance art, among others, and is very well known for his very innovative work on the history of performance documentation. He's the editor of the volume Reconstructing Performance Art, Practices of Historization, Documentation, and Representation, which is forthcoming with Routledge in 2023. And we very much look forward to reading this volume. Tancredi, thank you so much for making time for our conversation. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for this lovely presentation, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be part of these two question series, and I'm very curious to hear all the interviews you are realizing. I'm sure it will be a great contribution to the reflection on this topic. As you have said in your presentation, my study of the processes of permanence and endurance of performance art initially developed with Horizon 2020 project founded by the European Union on the history of early performance art documentation. And as a theater and performance scholar, training in philosophy and theater and performance historiography in particular, my main interest has been in studying the disciplinary processes that performance art set in motion or produce in the fields of visual arts. So I've asked what happened in the visual arts and to the epistemology of visual arts when artists began to produce performances. That is something which is very different from the traditional art object in the visual arts. And how was performance itself shaped to be realized in this framework? So my interest has been to study a disciplinary history of performance art, to study through the documentation how performance was transmitted and produced in this field. As is well known, the debate on performance documentation has long been divided between those who argue that performance is ephemeral and cannot be saved, and other scholars and artists that with different ways and strategies argue that performance can remain and can be documented, it should be documented and remain. This debate has long revolved around an ontology, as based for a long time, I think, on an ontological discussion. So in a sense, the idea has been that there is a sort of being, essence of performance, sort of a set of essential properties of performance that one can describe, one can grasp, and from this ontological position, then one can say, one can decide if performance can or cannot be conserved. So the answer, the ontological position, led the answer to the question whether performance can or cannot remain. In my project and in my research, I've tried to turn the question on its head, and I've tried to think on another direction and thinking rather, how was the ontology of performance constructed through the processes of documentation? So the basic assumption has been that there is no single answer to as what to performance art is. So the ontology and mode of existence and permanence of performance art, I think, has been the result of negotiations. So that involved agents such as artists, curators, conservators, scholars, collectors, but also art institutions and funding bodies. So I think all these agents time to time negotiate how a performance, what performance art is, and how it should and can remain. So I think there is no objective being of this work that prescribe from the beginning whether they cannot or can or cannot remain. And there are precisely these processes around permanence that produce the ontologies of performance art, but also the paradigm of conservation, of reactivation. What I'm trying to say is that if we look at the history of performance art, we see that all the agents involved in it, not only artists, but also documenters, but also conservators, curators, and scholars, they don't have a passive role in what performance art is and what a work is. They actively participate in defining, with different strategies, in defining what the work is and what the heritage, how the heritage of performance art will remain. As you have wonderfully, I think, underlined in your recent edited volume, Object, Event, Performance, conservation as an agency, as a creative aspect, as a participative aspect in the unfolding of the artwork. And now to go back to your question, which is, I think, directed not only or not mainly to the processes of documentation, but to the conservation of performance as such, so as performance. I think I would say, yes, of course, performance can be conserved, and as it usually done in museum. But I think the subsequent question, and that for me is very crucial, is whether it should be conserved, and more importantly, how different preservation and conservation strategies produce specific performance histories and performance representation. So what are the consequences of different conservation strategies, of different understanding of our work? For me, in other words, I think it's more of a political issue, an issue of cultural politics and policies. So dealing also with questions and issues such as ownership, access, copyright, and right to reperform. And this brings me to your second question. So that is, what does it mean to conserve performance? My answer comes from an interdisciplinary perspective, from a perspective of someone who is trained as a theater performance scholar and studies performance in visual arts. So in comparing the perspective, the ontologies and epistemology of theater and visual arts, I think it's fruitful and interesting because it shows some disciplinary processes that are set in motion by these differences. I would say in the field of theater, the question of whether performance can be conserved would be rather strange, or the answer would be obvious, because it is clear that performance remain. I mean, if actors, directors, or theater companies were to think that they could not repeat their work, they wouldn't do the job. And the theater wouldn't exist without the very certainty of the possibility of remaining and repeating the pieces, the performances. But in the visual arts, in an art museum, on the other hand, the issue is crucial, is not obvious. And why? Because I think, and I think this is an important point, because I think it relates to a specific disciplinary knowledge, to a specific disciplinary practices and ideas about what an artwork is, and also what the mission is of the professional that preserve those artworks. So I would say performance is not performance. Performance, and this thing shows that performance is something which is, for me, is highly dependent on contextual factors, on disciplinary frameworks, on disciplinary and local ontologies. In the field of art conservation, there has been, in the field of conservation of performance in art museums, there's been a great innovation in the last years, and I think this series is one of who testifies it very well. And the focus has shifted very much from the preservation of the physical state of art objects to the preservation of artworks' identities, so the work-defining properties. And there are many new instruments. I mean, the leading museum in the world has built many new instruments to make it possible to, let's say, to grasp, to fix, to document the artist's intention and allow it to be transmitted and to be accessed for a future audience. And this is great. I think, however, that there is an idea, a concept that could be problematic if we want the performance art heritage to have a long future. And this idea, which might be problematic, is the idea of identity of the work. I think it's a central idea, it's a crucial idea, but it's also problematic on the other hand. So I think this is something which is interested me very much. How to define the identity of a work? I think the idea of the identity, and the concept that the task of conservator is to preserve the identity over time, while ensuring, of course, the changes in non-essential aspects of the work, can lead to different understanding of what is the meaning of performance conservation. My opinion, based on my study, on my research, is that it is not possible to define the identity of a work or its core or its truth from the very beginning. And more importantly, it's not possible to define from the outset how the work has to be reactivated and to prescribe how it has to be done. I do not believe that the artist. I do not believe that there is no identity of the artwork. I just think that the identity of the artwork are revealed in history. So I don't think that the artists themselves often, or their intention, the initial intention, often contains and can predict all potentiality and virtualities of their work. Especially if we are talking about performance art, which has been a deeply contextual and irrational practice. I mean, we see many artists change their idea about their own work over time. So what to do with these changes? And these reveal, or artists themselves of these works, these performances are living works, something which are not finished. The identity is not finished in the moment they are done for the first time. And here I think some idea or some insight from theater can be fruitful to open a conversation on this topic. For the sake of clarity, I use very traditional general example. I use example from a kind of theater practice that have a text, a play, and a performance. We can possibly also expand this discussion more to contemporary form, where the performance itself is the work and not the representation of a text. But let's do a mental experiment. What would have happened if Sophocles' Antigonus or Shakespeare Hamlet could have been performed only in the exact manner that Shakespeare or Sophocles has prescribed or wanted them to be staged? I think not only we wouldn't have today Brecht's Antigones or the Living Theater Antigones, but probably the piece itself would be probably just a relic of a time gone by. So I think the very challenge, the difficult challenge is that to continue to live, the performance heritage must be modified. And as I said, in the long run, artists themselves cannot foresee all the potentialities because it depends on context, on history, or what happened in society. Paraphrasing Carmelo Bene, which was one of the greatest figure in the theater avant-garde in Italy, he said, or he wrote in '64, it would be perverse to deny Shakespeare the unfaithfulness that is due him. So it's a sort, this brings a topic that for me is important to say, this work, the great works ask new performers, new artists to take them and to make from them to reveal something new in those works, I think. And all what museums are already doing now, so collecting scores, interviews with artists, video documentation, tutorial, dossiers on how to train performance, I think they are great tools, they are great practice because they document the original intention of the artist and give access to it. And I think it would be great today to see how exactly Shakespeare would have staged his own pieces. It would be great. The question, I think, is, and I come back to the question, what does it mean to conserve performance? The question is the only way to stage this performance the way that the artists themselves have prescribed, or we can imagine in future an idea of performance conservation that, of course, define what the artist wanted, the original idea of the artist, but also let this heritage to live on a sort of common good, to something, an intangible heritage that also new artists in new contexts can take, change, transform, shift, or maybe also criticize, because I mean, because this is a potentiality that that performance has, and I think all this instrument can be seen, all this documentation instrument can be seen as a sort of scenario or a sort of canovaccio, to remain in theater terms, a sort of something which is not in itself completed and finished, but something which testifies, documents an intention, but also leaves undecided what is what the identity, partially undecided what the identity of the work is in history. So I think that I'm aware that this cannot be a general principle, because it has to be clarified from case to case with artists, and it implies question of copyright. It implies many questions that has also to do with legal framework. But I think, as an idea, as a provocation, it would be interesting, because in a way it could be a way to be faithful also to the critical tradition of performance art, with potential to be something that change, the shift, and they also provoke some disturbance in the relation between art, artist, institution, and artwork.
Tancredi, thank you so much. If I could follow up on several things, because it's, you know, it has been just very revealing when you said, when you evoke this idea of performance as something inherently changeable, you know, so on the one hand, you are saying that performance, the notion of performance changes by its very nature while we approach it from different disciplinary perspectives. So there is this almost like epistemic shifts that are happening while approaching performance from performance studies perspective, perhaps theater studies, right? Perhaps visual arts, art history studies. But then there is this changeability of the very performance that, you know, as a form, is this something that mutates and changes over time. And you also evoke this idea of identity, which, you know, I have been working on as well for a while, and it's both fruitful and challenging to evoke it and to kind of continue thinking about this, because at the end of the day, you may always ask, you can always ask, you know, are there limits to identity? Are there limits actually to changeability of a work?
Thank you. This is a very challenging question. I think also this is a crucial point, and it's a very difficult philosophical problem and ontological problem. While you were talking about this idea, I was thinking it comes to me in mind an essay of Walter Benjamin about translation, the task of translator, which I mean, it would be interesting. I mean, to think the role of conservator as a translator in this way. And he says that the task of translator, I mean, I just now I remember, I cannot say exactly what Benjamin said, just remembering, but Benjamin, the idea is that the translation is not just a copy of the original, but is something that brings the original closer to the universal language, that added something to the original. So you have the original and you have something which is not destroyed the original text, but reveals something which was in a way hidden in the original text and was no longer visible, and becomes visible in the relation with these new instances. And I think the problem of identity, if we think the problem of identity as a relational problem rather than as a problem of essence, I think maybe we could find some resources to answer this question, which remains a difficult question, but we don't have to lose the original work in which we document the intention of the artist, the idea of the art, but every kind of documentation is not complete, is not finished. I mean, cannot say everything, cannot answer every question we have to it. So I think a new instance of the work can reveal something new, and the question, I think, could be more not if the identity remains, but how it what is the relationship between these two instances? What makes these new instances? What kind of sentence? I mean, if we think this as a language, what kind of answer is the new work as related to the old work? So, and this, I think, is something which can take both in consideration the idea of conserving something, because I also think that it's very important to know what the artist wanted to. I mean, what was the idea of the artist, and on the other end, I mean, to see what these ideas set in motion in new context, in new world. So this would be my idea on this point of changing identities.
Changing, same as Baraka and Rebecca Schneider obviously theorized, but it's so fascinating. And also, you know, I couldn't agree more. This notions of intentionality or intention needs to be, you know, critically revised as it is being used in museological and conservation approaches, because, you know, obviously there is this plurality of intentions that affect object or the work's identity, performance, work identity, but also they too, in their plurality, shift and kind of unfold, change over time. But could I pick your brain on something related, obviously, Tancredi, something that you also said. You said, you know, you obviously worked on the notion of the documentation of performance. I wonder, you know, how does documentation conserve performance, and when does conservation actually exceed this notion of documentation from your own particular perspective?
Yeah, it's very important, I think, because documentation, from my perspective, documentation is something which is unstable. I mean, the idea itself of document something is unstable, and it refers not only to the classic documentation tools, photograph, videos, but I mean, also a new performance can be a sort of documentation of an old performance. I think which is what is interesting in the idea of documentation and how documentation conserve performance this is a process that I think has to do with I would call these ideological positions, which is not to say in a negative manner, but to say in a sort of idea that are processes, they are performative processes. We see also in iconic performance works that sometimes we have photographs that are part of a medium of the piece, and sometimes this is very clear because they are thought of as the medium of the piece. So, and then we can say traditionally we would say that performance is more goes more in the direction of conceptual art, but you have photograph or videotapes where the status is not clear because they are traces of a live act, but at the same time their own history as a medium, as an artwork, is more important than the live act itself. And I think these are processes, on from my perspective, that that cannot be the distinction cannot be ontological. It is not whether a documentation, whether a piece of photograph is or is not a documentation that conserve or not a performance, but rather this is also something which is part of a process of negotiation that involves the artist, the collectors itself or herself. It's something that that cannot be decided also from the outset, I think, and it involves many different intentions that can also change in time. And there are also cases where artists and collectors were not did not agree of what a relic is or is not. So I think it's something which has to be defined also in a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And to this richness, what can be added is that conservation itself, as you so aptly pointed to, defines what performance is. Is there this notion of conservation at all existent within theater studies? Or is conservation something absolutely foreign? Because as you said, well, theater obviously already understands performance as something returning, repeatable, iterant, right? And something that is always there and kind of moves through different manifestations.
It's not so central, I would say. I think in theater, that of course, theater study is a huge branch, so a huge discipline, so there are many different ideas of what is the heritage of theater history, what is the temporality of theater performance. But I would say in general, my feeling is that the notion of archive or archivation is more central than the notion of conservation, because as you said now, theater is iterable, theater pieces and performance can be repeated and can be reperformed. And so the idea and how the object of art itself, the epistemic object of art itself, the theater event, the performance is defined in theater. It's something that would be difficult to address with the notion of conservation, because conservation, I would say in the visual art, the notion of conservation itself has been changed a lot in last time. But I think in other fields, the notion of conservation is still very much related to an idea of artwork as something material, fixed, and that can be preserved from change. So I think, no, the notion of conservation is in theater studies, or in general in theater study, not so often used. Of course, there are also theater museums. There are also enterprise of conserving theater costumes, scenery, and you have there the notion of conservation, but I think in a more traditional pattern and sense, not the conservation of performance itself.
this is just so fascinating because, I think both the notion of performance and conservation put together allow us to rethink what one and the other is. And I think at the end of the day, it's just very clear from our conversation how performance becomes this kind of thinking device almost, to understand the world of conservation, but also other worlds and disciplinary fields better. Tancredi, I couldn't thank you more. That was absolutely insightful and absolutely rich. And thank you so much again for your time and this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you again for this conversation. I'm very happy to be part of it. And yeah, thank you.